Welcome back to episode 2. I'm joined again by Frank and Sander, and we are also joined by Ruud. We are going to be discussing why ERP transformations are so difficult. So, Frank, it is well known in the industry that ERP transformations are really difficult. Many fail. I think one of the statistics is 7 in 10 fail. In the last couple of months, I've had 5 or 6 clients reach out saying they're struggling and need help for someone to come in and review what's going wrong. But before we go into the details, just taking a step back, with lots of transformation overlapping, whether that be regulation, AI, cyber resilience. So the question I don't think is why are these ERP programs so hard, but how do they deal with multiple transformation ongoing at the same time? And working alongside CFOs, what is their view for managing these in parallel?
Well, Abby, thank you so much. So good to see you again. Great to be back in Amsterdam. And I'm also really happy that in this episode 2, we talk about ERP implementations and how to make them more enjoyable, to really, make this such a inspiring journey. And now I need to stop laughing a little bit because indeed, as you say, a large percentage of these big implementations is still not bringing the benefits, is still not perceived as that high inspirational journey. And there's many reasons for that, but talking to CFOs especially, who, by the way, very often are the ultimate executive owners of these journeys, I think you still see that there's a combination of various reasons, of course, and how you set it up, but just as a starting point, I think they are still perceived very often as technical implementations, which is not giving the full business benefits in scope. The sense of urgency is still missing or not made explicit. They start with the IT system and not with a phase 0 or really thinking through about how your future company should look like. And I think ultimately the program is almost set up for failure. And that is such a pity. It's unnecessary. You will create fear, and it's simply a missed opportunity to make your company fit for the future and much more agile. But anyway, that's my perception. I mean, you as a consultant here and INNOVERV, you are dealing every day with these big programs. I know you asked the questions, but just tell us a little bit, what do you see in the market?
Yeah, you touched on one of the points, business-led. I think it's well known now in the industry that it needs to be business-led, finance-led, not IT-led. However, making sure, there's one thing saying it's business-led, but then putting your people into that program that can then sponsor and also make sure it works for that organization is key. And sometimes it's balancing the priorities over the business priorities versus investing their time into these programs. I think, Sander, you've had some experience also of setting these programs up, putting the business into them. How do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we said it in the last episode, change management is also very important. You really make sure you bring your organization along and they really explain to the key decision makers why it's so important to make sure they understand it. One thing I want to say on failure, and I think failure in itself is not bad, right? Of course, you don't want the program to fail. Yeah. I think it's important that you learn from your mistakes. Yeah. And if you really make if you fail early, right? But I always say it's better to learn from mistakes and never make the same mistake twice. That's really very important. But I think that's also, don't be too afraid to make mistakes, because you will make mistakes. Everybody will make mistakes, but make sure you make them early if you can, and really also acknowledge them and take actions on them to actually correct it. But the most important, and Frank, you said it already, is really to make sure that senior management really understands what the program looks like, and you have their support.
But I think that is on the way you see the challenge in those companies, like the CFO or the CEO or the COO. They have multiple programs running, and they're all important, and whether they have to do with changing because of tariffs or other stuff. And so, how do you make sure that this program really is one of the most important that you're running, because it's it's enabling your strategy, changing your operating model. It's not running a system upgrade, as you guys said before. But then as a CFO, you have your day job, you have the other programs. How do you deal with that, So what it means, you guys have been CFO, you probably do all the business as usual during the day, and you do all the programs at night, and at a certain time you can't manage that anymore. And so what gets the priority. Business as usual always gets
Always.
the priority, specifically if it gets tough or more difficult.
Yeah.
And then so you see the impact happening on the program. Control loosens a bit, so you see some things coming in. That's not good, and that's, I think, one of the challenges that I've seen as well.
It's absolutely a balancing act. There are two elements to that, I would say. One element is that as a CFO, you also have a responsibility to really bring that to the senior management that, hey guys, I cannot do this at night, right? You have to take this seriously, and here's the impact on the business if we don't do it, or if we fail, right? You're going to spend whatever hundreds of millions, but let's make sure we get the benefits. And what I have seen also companies do, not many, I must say, but I've seen companies doing, making actually a business leader responsible for the business transformation.
I completely agree.
And that sometimes, it depends a little bit on the culture of the organization, whether that works or not. Sometimes the CTO or the CFO are almost the perfect leaders to do it. But it is important that really it's an entire responsibility. And if you are a CTO or a CFO and you have the responsibility, it's your responsibility to make sure you bring it back to your co-leaders and make sure they understand it, right? Because if that doesn't happen, it's going to be a night job, and the risk of failure is quite big.
And I've seen that as one of the best practices. Everybody talks about top management commitment, which is probably true for all of the other programs that are around there. And top management commitment is quite difficult if you haven't seen it, been there before. And so taking somebody out of the business that has the experience and you can free up and has the authority in the organization to actually speak up, I actually see as a very good example of how you could run a program. So you have somebody who dedicates full time on that program, knows the company, and can work close with CFO or whoever else owns it. I think that works. I've seen that work in the past, and maybe it doesn't work with all companies, but it's definitely a difference to having somebody part-time trying to run a transformation which is actually defining the future of your company.
I think this is one of the misunderstandings from the beginning, though. We've already touched on that it's not just a technical implementation, that it needs to be business-led, but in reality, these enterprise transformation programs are fundamental rewiring of the business processes. Just take finance alone. You've got tax, accounting, touches supply chain, and then even how accountability and the operating model works across the business. I think everyone agrees that the processes and working capital need to be improved, and that everyone agrees that this should be accelerated and the transformation should be accepted. But unless someone is personally accountable, these will fail. So ahead of deep diving into these complex transformation programs, there's this well-known phrase, and I think we touched on it briefly in episode 1, phase 0, or call it get ready phase. A lot of effort is in the preparation. Now we know an additional key area where these programs fail is data. And data is one of the key points that you will look at in your preparation phase, having to get right. How has this helped in your journey, Ruud, of implementations, having the preparation phase or prepare phase, as many people would know it?
Well, extremely critical, and I think many of the programs that we have seen fail are probably already started to fail at the phase 0 of the preparation phase, because that's where you lay the foundation. That's where you make sure that the transformation enables the strategy. That's where you look at the business case in a way, and that drives the governance for the rest of the program as well. So everything that you don't set right from the beginning, including looking at discussion that we just had, what people do you need in the program to run it, what governance do you need, quite interesting. I think it was discussed in the previous episode. The governance is extremely important, but not to the extent that it slows you down. So what is governance is not making sure that you have a process that stops everything and every decision making, but that balances between speed and managing risk. And I think that is all the things that you do in a phase 0.
Yeah, and because you asked specifically about data, I think data is close to my heart. And what Ruud is saying is 1000% true, but you need to detail out your data model. That means data dimensions. How does your data model look like? I mean, what KPIs, what are definitions? You would be surprised how the basics are not on order, are not well known. How does your P&L structure look like? You know, and not for the company of today, but for the company of tomorrow. How does it all rolling up? How do you allocate your cost? I mean, all these kind of things is really helpful when you already know that before you start to implement the system. And there's many people who say, yeah, we take a template and then we start from there. I'm not necessarily against it, but it's all depending on the quality of your first template. So if that is very good, great. If it's not very good, it's pretty useless. So you need to have these things on order for the company of the future.
I truly believe that people don't think enough about things, and some of these things are valuable even if you decide not to continue. The data, you're getting your data model in order has nothing to do with your system implementation. You have to do that anyway in order to operate. A couple of other examples in my experience is legal optimization. Sometimes you have way too many legal entities and you all have to transfer them in your transformation process. So if you reduce the number of legal entities, that's a good thing to spend your time on. Another element is report rationalization. Companies have too many reports which cover the same KPIs. You can really go through them, optimize them, because you then don't have to migrate them to the new situation. So I strongly believe that sometimes, yeah, maybe people spend too much time, but a prep period of, say, a year or 2 years, right, or a phase 0 could be time well spent. Don't overdo that, but there's a lot of things you can do, which I would call no regret, because actually they have value in itself.
And it's taking, as you mentioned, just to highlight it, 1 to 2 years. It sounds like an extremely long time, but I tell you, that's what it's about to take. And it's time well spent, because you need to clean it up anyhow. You need to make a decision anyhow, regardless of a system. So a system implementation, if we call it a system implementation, is a really interesting momentum to make a leap step forward, to bring in new technologies, to optimize your data, to save costs, to do things in a smarter way, in the new modern way. So that is why you should really use it as an extremely inspirational journey. Bring people along, not make it too democratic, high speed, but start with the first 1.5 year phase 0. And that time you will gain back during the implementation, easily. So it's not delaying the whole program, it is just doing it in the right sequence.
And you're not yet running on a very high cost at that time.
Exactly.
Because you haven't brought in the big teams and doing all, and then you stall, and that's where it's going to be extremely difficult.
And what also is a good benefit, you can also show already some benefits to the organization, right? So that creates
you start to build your change management.
Exactly. So it's a very important element of it, because if you're in it, if you've done the design, now I would not say too simple, but then it's really execute, right? So, but the planning is very important.
And also the business case, well, it's been discussed a couple of times, but the business case often used as a rationale for the investment and then put away, where actually you should use the business case, as the guardrail for all the decisions you take throughout the process. So why do we do this? Is that in the business case or not? So, and you can probably do a lot of optimizations or whatever just by making sure you use the business case as a guardrail and not just as a rationale for the investment, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think in the business case, and we talked about it in the last episode a little bit, but you really have multiple elements of what the benefits are.
Agree.
And what I found sometimes difficult to explain to the board is for instance, the payback. Because the payback of business transformation is long, right? And you have to compete against other projects of the board to say, oh, it's a 3-year payback, but you have a 7-year or 6-year payback. So you need to make sure you also explain those elements and make sure you compete on the business benefits that really matter, right? And whether it's 6 years or 3 years, yes, that doesn't in itself sound that great, but there are other elements that are more important that you need to be able to explain.
And how you win back very quickly a lot of money is by making a plan about your future system landscape and switch off many of your legacy systems. Be careful, so don't switch off anything that you need, but at the same time, most companies have such a spaghetti of systems that is hardly used, difficult to maintain. If you already can kill a few systems or interfaces, that will immediately push down your cost and make your landscape much simpler. And I think there's also new insights. So it's really, I think, different than before, is that you now need to see, how do we go for one size fits all, best of breed, which modules of a ERP system do you bring together, where do you put AI technology. So I mean, it's just slightly more complex, I think. So you need independent advice, independent, very important word, because many of the SIs will be slightly more, well, how shall I say it, more biased towards a outcome that they like. You need an independent consultant to tell you this is probably how the best system landscape will look like going forward.
But don't forget that in many cases, when you have a legacy system, IT system, it's fully amortized. And now you're going to build a new system, and now you're going to tell the organization, now 10 years is way too long for amortization, you have to do it in 5 years. They had no cost because they had no amortization. So they're living in a pink cloud that there's no cost to the system because it's fully amortized. Now suddenly you're going to buy a new system and capitalize all these costs, and you're going to have amortization, so your cost is going up.
Yeah, but here I totally disagree, son.
But it's a fact.
It's
right?
not. Yeah, you're right about the amortization, but the hidden cost of maintaining all these systems, and the risk that you somehow things are broken.
P&L. It doesn't.
But you will know. But when the system is not any longer functioning well, you will see it in your P&L.
But in your business case, you don't see it in your P&L. So you have to properly explain these things, and I think people fail to explain these things properly.
Absolutely.
And therefore, either the programs are sized down because it's too expensive, but some of these things you really have to make sure you properly explain some of these elements because people don't understand it. And you're absolutely right. If you don't do anything, then your cost is going to probably explode, but you don't know that yet.
Well, I've actually run a couple of application modernizations exercises, and the business case in itself is quite big of these things, but you need to be able to explain, and you need to be looking broader than just the cost of the application that you switch off. The other thing is many of those will still have this piece, you know, they were this big, there's still this piece that is covered. How do you deal with that? There's not a reason to keep it alive, but how do you deal with that in the new process, in the new system? And that's quite interesting. But it's a good point, because it's sometimes forgotten, I feel, in current ERP transformations. I don't know how you see that, Abby, but that is a point that's not always directly on the table when these programs are being formed. Yeah.
And you know what is also a real interesting trend, I think, is that previously you had these big multinationals say one size fits all. We all go on one kernel, one SAP system, whatever. I think that is not necessarily any longer the best outcome for every company. So, of course, when you want to divest certain parts of the company or etc., then there's no need. It's actually counterproductive, I think, to integrate it all. And I do know many companies who say, no, we can work with many kernels, many different instances, or even different ERP systems. It's, I think, not necessarily a problem. It's maybe not the most efficient way, but it can give you flexibility. It will reduce the costs, reduce the risk. And as long as you make sure that the data come together, that you still have a data layer on top, etc., I think it's pretty
I
workable.
Agree, and I think also technology is helping us there. There's a lot of system software in the market that actually can help you do that. And the investment to really go from, say, 20 plus ERP systems to a single one is huge. Where if you can say, okay, let's go to 5 and then put an umbrella on top of it, it's an investment that actually improves your IT landscape. You reduce the number of systems complexity. Is probably the better investment. And that's absolutely people much more looking at.
And that's an interesting point, because that brings us also about more of the technology element of implementations. It's all the customizations that are being done, yeah. And if you want to put it all in one instance, it's probably you need more customization. And I think customizations is quite a big risk to any ERP transformation or business transformation even. And maybe, a bit harsh, but for the Netherlands with the polder model, as we say it, even more, and the people will say, oh, we've ever used it like this and we can't let go. And then you actually think, well, okay, then for a comfort level, we just leave this customization in. And that's actually killing the program. So you need to be quite hard in, and I think that comes back to change management, as you said before, Sander. We need to be able to convince people on why it's more important to try and adapt to a new operating model than trying to build in the old past. Yeah.
No, I think it's part of the prep, I would say, and it's definitely a discussion that you need to have with the organization, that do you need 40 business models, or can your customers be served by 10, right? Why do you need 40? Just add complexity. You need to have that conversation, but that conversation also requires a lot of data. For instance, you have to prove to the organization that certain business models actually are not profitable at all, because due to the complexity that you brought into your systems, actually the cost of doing that business is really not really meeting the requirements of the company, right? So that conversation is a very important conversation to have, because that's where you get the resistance in your organization that say, okay, hey, I'm doing new system, but we're going from 40 to 10 business models. Oh, they didn't tell you that? That conversation you really need to have as part of the planning starting process, that people that own those processes understand that they're going to change as well.
Yeah.
And I remember in my own experience that I was challenged by the board, that the board would say, okay, you can make these changes, but you cannot change these processes. It's good to have that conversation at the start and not somewhere when you're in the midst of it.
But to me, it is about what I always call the unrewarded complexity. So that means the complexity where the end customer or consumer is not prepared to pay for it.
Yeah.
So that you need to take out. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's probably 5 or 10% of all these processes where you do want to be different, maybe even complex, as long as you make a difference in the market.
Absolutely.
And where customers are willing to pay. And that is also an interesting discussion to have, I think. So when you do these big ERP implementations, say, where do you, give me the 5 or 10% where you do want to be different than your main competitor?
That is a good question, and that's going back to
difficult
business component modeling.
Yeah, exactly.
I would also challenge that a bit, because even for those areas, customization is probably not the answer. Looking at how you can be differentiated is the right thing to think about, but not customization. And companies.
I didn't say that.
Customization. I know, but it's an easy, very easy misinterpretation, because India and most companies already facing, of course, everything that you've done in the past on customization is hindering you going to the next release, getting the new cybersecurity areas in, getting aligned to new regulations. Yeah. Everything that is in customized makes it difficult.
But indeed, you're right, and I think you have to also reflect it in price, right? That for instance, if you keep certain customers on an old system and some other migrate to a new system, you really have to start pricing that out for your old customers, right? So that's a way of working on it. In practice, and my experience at least is that salespeople will always tell you, oh no, I'm going to lose my customer if you change it, right? So that's almost the default response. If you talk about limitation of liability, oh no, we have to give them unlimited liability because else they will walk. Well, they never walk, right?
And logistics people, planning people will say the same thing.
It is also a little bit of not a play, but you have to make sure you challenge your organization and really challenge them on do you really need it? But you're right. Sometimes you really need to differentiate and customize, right? And that's, I think, if you think about system implementation, I would always say just go with the standard. That's your starting point. And every place where the organization wants to deviate, they need to come to the table and to prove that the deviation is really something you can collectively agree upon, and then say, okay, then we customize.
And that is what makes it difficult, One of the things that makes it difficult, I agree.
Yeah, but it's interesting, so I'm a finance guy, Sander's a finance guy. In finance, most companies are not competing on the quality of their finance with their main competitor. Maybe in a few bits and pieces, but overarchingly, finance should work, should give you the required information, should do it very speedy, should be low cost, efficient, but that's about it for 90-95%. Let me put it that way. And so if you look to finance or to HR, it's an enabling process, and you are not competing on an enabling process. So it's all about reliability, reduce the risk, make it efficient. But in the end, ultimately, it will be outsourced, standardized, etc. I mean, how and when you need to frame and you need to think about it. But that's I think also a reality. So be careful indeed with customization, all this stuff, because in the end, it's not where you differentiate as a company in the market.
Yeah. So I agree. Moving forward on the customization element, just bringing it back to the technology. We've talked a lot about the business angle now. Ruud, I think a lot of people there are some people that have done ECC implementations and now many S4 transformations, S4 HANA transformations. There's this conversation out in the industry that S4HANA transformations are slightly more complex because of the landscape, the integrations, knowing where the processes will be across, whether that's your S4HANA core, whether that's your satellite systems. How do you see, or what's causing and driving the complexity in these implementations, focused on the technology?
I wouldn't say that it is more difficult or more complex. I think the only thing is it touches new angles versus what you had in the past. Now, actually, if you don't do it, you're probably going to be inhibited on embedding new technology like AI or other things, all the new technology that comes in. So if you're not on the cloud, or if you're not having this interoperability possibilities, that's what makes it difficult. So I don't think that, well, my personal view, but S4HANA is any more difficult than ECC was in the past. It puts just newer requirements for you, new requirements on the company that you actually need anyway to be able to be agile into the future. So it's a different way of thinking. I wouldn't say it's more complex in itself. I mean, I've seen some pretty complex ECC projects that were not easy. So I think it's not more difficult than ACC, it's a different, that would be my view.
It's more the mindset behind it.
I think, and it's not back to the system, so I agree to you, Ruud. However, we live in a time frame where we are trying to add non-financial data, for example, as we have seen with CSRD. Yeah. I mean, it's not originating from the Standard Chart of Accounts. It's not. We are struggling with definitions, etc., etc. So this was, I think, a challenge to every new ERP system and implementation. How do you integrate that with the existing data? We are used financial data, high quality, but it took us hundreds of years to invent IFRS and US GAAP and etc., etc., to how to make that the high quality that it currently is, audited by auditors, etc., etc. So, but the value, there's a lot of value in non-financial data, especially when they come from the outside. So it's nice to have internal data, that is already a big step forward. But if you are able to integrate external data, we know it's not 100% reliable, but how do you put it in the mix?
It's for sales, it's for supply chain.
Exactly, I'm with you.
And you actually, if you want to sense and respond on that, you need to have those new capabilities that are being maybe enabled by S4HANA, maybe not all executed by S4HANA, but you need that in place as the key foundation, I would say.
Okay, so I'm going to move us on now to the actual implementation and call it the delivery model of implementing ERP or in particular S4HANA. So what I see quite difficulties around is the effort and call it mandates around implementing some of these programs, whether that be writing documentation, the deliverables, test scripts, testing, the business testing, cleansing the data, reconciling the data, especially now it's a lot more data driven.
Yep.
We're seeing across the industry tools coming into play that allow us to use AI tools to effectively deliver these programs. What are your views and experiences on using these tools?
From my perspective, if I can kick it off, it's something that a lot of people talk about. I'm not sure how many people are actually doing it. For me, the important point is that it's all great and it can accelerate the program, can make it less costly, but it only accelerate current processes. So you can't give any, I mean, you still need to do the same things, but some things you can have, you know, an agent can do for you and make it therefore within a minute versus we take 3 weeks for it. But it still has to be done, and it still has to be governed, and it still has to fit in the overall program. So we can't say, well, like we do AI on the phase 0, and then we have all the answers on all those difficult questions that we had. So yes, it's definitely gonna improve the speed and the cost of delivery, but it needs to be managed wisely, I would say.
Yeah. Now, maybe two things. I personally believe that the implementation and the design, it's important that people in the organization are involved in that. I don't believe that leaving that all to consultants. I think it's very important that the own organization really understand what's changing and is part of making that change. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you're right, that's a lot of effort. There's hundreds of workshops that people have to go to, sit in there, and it will be on top of their normal working hours, right? So that's a huge effort. So I see a lot of opportunities there together with Roots. I have not really seen anything really particular working in practice. There are a lot of tools. Like Signavio is a very good tool in the SAP environment to really compare, okay, here's the standard SAP and what does my current ECC environment look like and where are the differences. So those are easy technology tools, and I think AI tools or machine learning tools, if you have the data, and assuming you have the data, you can actually get a lot of work done already up front. So I do expect a lot of benefits to come from that part, really helping the organization to go through some of the design phase. So I think the technology is probably there, and I hope to really see some actually good applications in practice, because the demand is there in the companies to do this. You can save a lot of money because it's an expensive part of the entire program.
Yeah, I would argue we're still delivering these the same way we were doing 10 to 15 plus years ago. So I think the time for change and to use AI to deliver and accelerate the delivery and reduce the involvement from both the business and SI, it's not just one side, is well and truly on the cards for the upcoming.
Yeah, and then I think what I see in practice very important, we talked about in the beginning, standardization, right? You really have to stick to the standard, because if you stick to the standard, that's going to save you in itself a lot of cost, because the cost is really in the customization. And I think it's almost kind of a challenge or an art to make sure you don't really customize too much.
But it's a question, eternal question is, what is the standard? Because in my view, there's many standards. So it's, yeah, and theoretically we all agree, but then in practice, what is the standard for a given process in a certain industry, certain company is not always that clear, I think. It's giving great, good-looking outcomes, but is it really viable? Is it really high quality? Does it really work? You need to spend a little bit more time there, I think. And so ultimately, I think you never should forget we are producing a new way of working in a system, and I don't care whatever the system is. And we all know that users, and we are all users, we hate a change. We hate it, and it will only work when there are two things in place. First of all, the functionality should be better than the previous system. So that is really important, with or without AI, that the functionality that they perceive is much better. And secondly, that you really help them 10 times as big as we are currently doing. You help them to understand how the system is working. So even you, Abby, young at heart, when you look to your iPhone, you're probably using 10, 20% of the functionality, I guess. And then we are probably using 5% of the functionality, whatever, and 3%. But anyway, that's exactly. So what I mean to say, there's so much benefit in these systems, but you need to really take people by the hands to use them to the full extent.
Yeah. So I agree with standardization, but you need to define what's the standard. And then I think it's important where AI can help is to give some of that experience to the users
because it's not
referring to.
Because it's not customized.
Although they do a standardized way, they still recognize, for instance, terminology or other elements that the company is used to use. So they recognize it, but still a different way of using it. Yeah. But it's something that they recognize, rather than they certainly say, okay, terminology A changed to B, and they don't recognize it anymore. It's exactly the same, but it feels different. And I think AI can help there, because they can really bring that extra experience for the users, I think.
Definitely, and we'll be tackling that in the upcoming episode. But I think we all agree that transformation needs transformation in how we deliver it. So moving then on to the big one, and then looking at how real AI is, coming up in episode 3. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.